It was Christmas Eve. The swamp went on forever, dark and black under a sky with no moon. Elara Brooks pressed her cheek against the cold metal of her rifle scope. She watched fog move through the mangrove roots like smoke rising from a grave. Somewhere in the darkness, the enemy was waiting. They always were. The meeting before the mission had been simple. They needed to rescue 2 hostages from a building near the river. The information showed only a few guards, easy escape paths, and low danger. Bravo 7 had done harder missions before breakfast. But somewhere between looking at the satellite pictures and actually being on the ground, everything had gone wrong. Elara moved a little in the mud hole they were using as cover. Water was getting into her boots, even though they were supposed to be waterproof. Her M110 sniper rifle lay across her lap. It was wrapped in protective cover that was losing the fight against the wet swamp air. Around her, 7 Navy SEALs crouched in the same uncomfortable positions, ready for anything. Their faces were covered with camouflage paint that the rain had turned into messy patterns. Sergeant Kyle Hale knelt 3 feet away. He was studying a wrinkled map through night vision goggles that kept flickering because of the moisture. At 38, he was the oldest soldier on the team. He had been on 12 missions and moved through dangerous areas like someone casually checking their mailbox. He had not looked at Elara directly since they arrived 6 hours ago. She was used to it. At 19, she was younger than some of their rifles. She was the youngest sniper ever sent to this particular piece of jungle, a fact that her teachers had mentioned with both pride and worry. The SEALs had been more direct about what they thought. Kids go get someone killed. She had heard Corporal Jason Webb mutter during the helicopter ride in. He had not even tried to be quiet. Probably herself first, but still. Elara had said nothing then. She said nothing now as far-away gunfire crackled through the trees. It was answered by the deeper sound of a Pecan machine gun. The hostage rescue had walked right into a trap. The building had been bait. The small number of guards was a lie. Now Bravo 7 was stuck in a swamp with half their radio equipment broken by the wet air, and enemy soldiers coming from 3 different directions. "Radios are dead," announced Marcus Cole, their communications expert. Water was dripping from his headset. Got maybe 5% power and nothing but static. Hale swore quietly, one precise word that perfectly described how bad things were. He looked at the sky where thick clouds promised more rain. It was Christmas morning, Elara thought. Somewhere back home, people were opening presents. Here they were counting bullets and hoping rescue would come before the enemy did. The sound of engines floated across the water. Not the friendly sound of American helicopters, but the higher noise of trucks carrying heavy weapons. Elara felt the team get tense around her. Hands gripped rifles that were already slippery from the moisture. "They're getting ready to attack," said Lieutenant David Park, the team leader. His voice stayed calm, but Elara could see him thinking hard behind his eyes. They were separated from help, had limited bullets, no air support, and an enemy force that kept getting bigger. The numbers were not good. Through her scope, Elara studied the tree line 400 yards away. Movement in the shadows showed at least 20 enemy soldiers, maybe more. They were being careful and professional. These were not untrained fighters. Someone was giving them orders. "Permission to move to a higher position," she said, her voice cutting through the rain. "I can get a better view of where they're gathering." Hale did not even look up. "Negative. Stay where you are, Sergeant. If we wait until they're ready, we won't have—" I said, "Hold." Hale's voice left no room for argument. "You're on radio watch. Let the adults handle the planning." The put-down hurt more than the cold rain running down her neck. Elara wanted to argue. She wanted to point out that she had scored expert on every shooting test, that she had graduated at the top of her class at sniper school. That age meant nothing when you were looking through a scope at 2,000 yards. But she had learned early that arguing with men like Hale was pointless. They would believe what they wanted to believe. The first mortar shell hit at 3:15 a.m. It exploded in a tree 50 yards to their left. The blast shook water from the leaves above in a sudden shower, and the team scattered to better hiding spots. Elara rolled behind a fallen log, bringing her rifle up as more shells screamed overhead. They were testing their aim, moving the explosions closer to find the right distance. The technique was professional and careful. Someone with training was giving orders, adjusting based on where the shells landed. Elara watched the pattern of explosions, figuring out where they were coming from. The mortars were old Soviet style, probably Chinese copies. 82 millimeters, she guessed from the sound. They were probably 3,000 meters away, firing from higher ground to cover more area. Each explosion sent pieces of metal flying through the air, deadly metal that could tear through skin and bone. The team was in okay cover, but okay would not be enough if the enemy figured out exactly where they were. They needed to move or stop the mortars. Staying put meant death. Just simple math. Amount of explosives divided by the size of the impact area. They've got mortars. Webb shouted over the explosions. Where did they get mortars? Does it matter? Park was on the radio, trying to reach anyone on any channel. We need air support now, or we're going to be paced. Another shell hit closer, covering them with mud and debris. Elara wiped her scope lens clean and searched the darkness. The mortar position would be set back, protected, probably able to move after firing. But there would be spotters, people calling out adjustments to aim the shells at the target. Find the spotters and you could blind the mortars. She caught movement at 900 yards. A man with binoculars, visible for just a moment against an opening in the trees. Elara tracked him, calculating wind drift, humidity effects, the way rain would slow down the bullet. She could make the shot, 90% sure, maybe higher. Sergeant, she called. I can see their spotter. Western tree line, higher position. I can... Brooks, I swear to God, if you don't shut up and watch that radio. Hale's response was cut off by another explosion, this one close enough to make their teeth rattle. When the ringing in Elara's ears faded, she heard someone screaming. Private Tyler Grant had been hit by shrapnel in the leg. Blood was pumping through his fingers even though Park was frantically putting on a tourniquet. The kid was 22, 3 years older than Elara, and he was crying for his mother as his leg turned the swamp water dark. Corpseman, Park yelled. Then he remembered they did not have a medic. This was supposed to be an easy rescue. No one expected anyone to get hurt. Elara crawled to Grant, pressing bandages against the wound while Park worked the tourniquet tighter. The private's face was white as a sheet. He was going into shock fast. They needed medical help. Needed it hours ago. But the radio was still dead, and the mortars were still falling. And through it all, Elara could picture the spotter in her mind, calmly adjusting fire to kill them all. 300 meters, Cole announced, watching movement through the trees. They're coming around from the north. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach us. Hale made a decision. Fall back to the backup position. Cole, you and Martinez laid down cover fire. Everyone else moves now. They move like professionals. 2 shooting while 5 moved, then switching. But they were leaving equipment behind, using up bullets to buy seconds. And Grant was dead weight between Park and Webb. Elara brought up the rear, her rifle across her chest, eyes searching for targets that never stayed still long enough for a clear shot. The backup position was a dip in the ground, barely deep in a foxhole, surrounded by mangrove roots that hid them but did not really protect them. They piled in 8 people in a space meant for 4. Elara found herself pressed against Grant. His breathing had become shallow and uneven. He would not make it through the night. Radio. Hale snapped at her. Get that thing working, or I'll find someone who can. Elara wanted to point out that she was not a communications expert. That Cole was the expert, and even he could not make the water-damaged electronics work. But she took the dead radio and pretended to work on it, because at least it gave her something to do besides count the minutes until the enemy found them. The rain got heavier, turning from a steady drizzle to a tropical downpour. They could barely see anything. Through the wall of water, Elara could hear engines, voices, the metal clanking of weapons being set up. The enemy was taking their time, setting up a trap with professional skill. They knew the Americans were not going anywhere. At 4:30 a.m., Grant stopped breathing. Park tried CPR for 3 minutes before Hale quietly put a hand on his shoulder. They had no body bags, no way to carry him. They laid him in the shallow water and kept moving because that was all they could do. The moment stretched on, fragile and terrible. Park's hands were still on Grant's chest, compressions forgotten. His face was blank, shock taking over his emotions. Webb had turned away, shoulders shaking. Martinez was checking his ammunition with mechanical precision. Counting magazines, he had already counted twice. Elara had seen death in training videos, clean and educational. Teachers had lectured about combat casualties, stress reactions, the importance of staying focused despite loss. The PowerPoint presentations had made it seem manageable, a problem with known solutions and clear steps to follow. This was different. Grant's eyes stayed open, rainwater collecting in the sockets. His skin was already losing color, taking on a waxy look of meat left too long in the refrigerator. He had been alive 10 minutes ago, complaining about the rain and joking about Christmas dinner back at base. Now he was an object, weight to be managed and eventually transported. The change from person to thing happened too fast, without ceremony or acknowledgement. One moment Grant existed, the next he did not. The universe had not noticed or cared. Rain kept falling. The enemy kept advancing. Time continued moving forward, not caring about individual tragedy. The argument started at 5 a.m. Voices rose despite the need for quiet. Elara kept her head down, carefully cleaning her rifle even though it did not need cleaning. The action was calming and familiar. Take apart, wipe, check, put back together. Her teachers had drilled the movements into her muscle memory, and now they provided comfort when comfort was hard to find. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. Basic training at Fort Jackson, where drill sergeants had screamed themselves hoarse trying to break her. Advanced individual training, where she had outscored every male recruit in her class and received death threats written on bathroom walls because of it. Sniper school, where the teachers had been professional enough to hide their doubt, but not enough to completely hide it. Each step had been harder than the last, not because of the physical demands, but because of the weight of expectation. She was representing every woman who might come after her, proving or disproving possibilities that went far beyond just her own abilities. The pressure was suffocating sometimes, knowing that her failures would be blamed on her being a woman, while her successes would be dismissed as exceptions. "We need to break away," Martinez insisted. "Move west, try to reach the river." "They'll cut us down before we make 50 yards, Park countered. "We dig in here. Wait for dawn, call for fire support." "With what radio?" Webb pointed at the useless equipment. "We're dead either way, but at least moving gives us a chance." Elara listened to them debate tactics they had learned in classrooms, theories that sounded good on paper. But she was watching the tree line, counting muzzle flashes, tracking movement patterns. The enemy was not setting up to attack. They were setting up something bigger. "They're bringing in artillery," she said quietly. The argument stopped. Hale turned to her, his expression impossible to read in the darkness. "What?" "Artillery. Maybe mortars. Maybe something heavier. Listen." She pointed southeast where a distinct metallic scraping sound carried across the water. "That's a towed gun being positioned. They're going to drop shells on us until there's nothing left to shoot at." Park strained to hear what she was describing. "You sure?" "Yes, sir." Era's voice stayed steady. "I can hear the crew working. 3 men, maybe 4. They're having trouble with the mud. It keeps bogging down the wheels, but they'll have it set up in 10 minutes. "Kids hearing things," Webb muttered. "Stress does that." But Hale held up a hand for silence. In the quiet that followed, they could all hear it. The scrape of metal on metal. The grunting of men straining against weight. Elara had been right. "How far?" Hale asked, his tone different now. Not dismissive. Focused. 1,900 meters, maybe 2,000. Elara closed her eyes, building a mental map from sound alone. Southeast, elevated position. They're using the old temple ruins for cover. "Nobody can shoot that far," Martinez said. "Not in this weather. Not at night." Elara said nothing. Her longest confirmed kill was 1,800 meters, made on a sunny day at a range where she could see her target clearly. This would be harder. Much harder. The wind was unpredictable, swirling between the trees. Humidity would slow down the bullet. Rain would push it off course. And she could not see the target, only hear it. Hale was doing his own calculations, weighing impossible odds against certain death. Finally, he looked at Elara with something that might have been respect or might have been desperation. "You think you can make that shot?" The honest answer was no. The smart answer was to admit her limitations, to let someone else try. But Elara thought about Grant's empty eyes, about 7 men who would die if she did nothing, about the mother waiting back home for a daughter who might never come back. "Yes, Sergeant," she said. "I can make it." They gave her the best position they had, a slight rise that added maybe 6 inches of elevation. Elara set up her rifle carefully, checking each part of her setup with mechanical precision. The scope lens was fogged. She breathed on it, used the heat from her breath to clear the glass, then wiped it with a cloth that was only slightly less wet than everything else. Behind her, the team waited in tense silence. She could feel their doubt, heavy as the rain. They had given her this chance because they had no other options, not because they believed in her. That was fine. Elara had stopped needing their belief months ago. She opened the waterproof pouch at her belt, pulling out a folded piece of paper, her mother's letter, sent 2 weeks ago and carried through 3 countries to reach her. The handwriting was shaky, arthritis making each word a small victory, but the message was clear. You are strong enough. You just need them to see it. Elara folded the letter carefully, returned to the pouch, and settled behind her rifle. The first problem was finding the target. She could hear the gun crew working, but sound was tricky in the swamp. It bounced off water, echoed through trees, and seemed to come from 3 directions at once. She needed to see something to confirm, even though she could barely see anything. Elara switched to thermal imaging, scanning the tree line in sections. 1,900 meters was at the very edge of what her scope could see. The image was grainy and blurry because of moisture in the air, but there, near the ruins, she spotted heat signatures, for men moving with purpose. One of them stood a little apart from the others, calling out instructions. That was the gun captain. Second problem, ballistics. At this distance, she was not shooting at where the target was, but at where it would be when the bullet got there. 2 seconds of flight time, maybe 2.5 with the drag from humidity. A man could move a lot in 2.5 seconds. But the gun captain was not moving much. He was supervising, standing in one spot while his crew worked. Elara watched his pattern. 3 steps right to check the aim. 2 steps back to the firing controls. Pause for 5 seconds. Repeat. Third problem, environmental factors. Elara started calculating. Numbers flowed through her mind with the ease of long practice. Wind was 8 miles per hour from the northwest, gusting to 12. That was 4 inches of drift at 2,000 yards, maybe 6. Temperature was 72 degrees, humidity 95%. The bullet would drop more than expected and lose speed faster. She needed to aim high to make up for the extra drag. She ran through ballistics one more time, double-checking each variable. Her M110 fired 7.62 NATO rounds, muzzle velocity 2,800 feet per second. At this range, the bullet would be going slower than the speed of sound when it arrived. That changed everything about how it would behave. Slower bullets were less stable and more affected by environmental conditions. The margin for error was tiny. Behind her, she could hear the team settling into position, preparing for whatever came next. Webb was praying, his lips moving silently. Martinez was checking his rifle for the 10th time, his hands shaking slightly. Cole had his eyes closed, doing breathing exercises to control the adrenaline. Park was watching her, his face showing nothing. They were depending on her, not because they believed in her, but because she was their only option. The difference mattered. When this was over, assuming they survived, some would still see her as a kid who got lucky. Others might admit she had skill, but say it was natural talent rather than endless hours of practice. Very few would understand that she had made herself into this through willpower, determination, and a refusal to accept limits others tried to put on her. Rain was the wild card. Each drop that hit the bullet would push it slightly off course. Not much per drop, but over 2,000 yards those tiny amounts added up. Elara studied the rain pattern, watched how it fell in sheets, and timed the breaks between gusts. There, a 3-second window where the rain got lighter. She would have to shoot during that window and hope it lasted long enough. "Whenever you're ready," Hale said quietly. He was not rushing her. That was something at least. Elara made a final adjustment to her scope, calculating 11 different variables in the space between heartbeats. She exhaled slowly, emptying her lungs, letting her body settle into perfect stillness. The gun captain moved into position, checking the aim. 3 steps right, 2 steps back. Pause. The rain lessened. Wind dropped to 8 miles per hour. Steady. Time stretched. And in that stretched moment, Elara saw everything with absolute clarity. The target, the path the bullet would take, the exact point where bullet would meet flesh. She saw it not as hope or prayer, but as mathematical certainty. Her finger pressed a trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. Muzzle flashed bright in the darkness. The sound was surprisingly quiet. A single sharp crack swallowed by the swamp. Then silence. 2.5 seconds of silence where nobody breathed, nobody moved. Even the enemy seemed to hold still, waiting for whatever came next. Through her scope, Elara watched the gun captain's head snap back. He crumpled, and the men around him scattered in sudden panic. The gun sat silent, abandoned. Its crew was fleeing into the jungle. "Holy shit," Webb whispered. "She actually made it." Elara did not respond. She was already tracking new targets, the training taking over. The enemy was confused, their organized attack falling apart. She fired again, dropping a man carrying what looked like a radio. Then again, taking out a soldier who was trying to gather the others. Each shot was easier than the last, the distance getting shorter as targets showed themselves in their confusion. Covering fire. Hale was moving now, taking command with new energy. Martinez, Cole, suppressed that western flank. Park, prep for displacement. "We're getting out of this hellhole." The SEALs opened up with everything they had, and the jungle erupted in gunfire. But now they were shooting with purpose, with hope. The enemy was breaking apart, falling back. The trap was falling apart. Extraction came at 7 a.m. 2 Marine helicopters dropped from the clouds like avenging angels. Elara stood in the rain, watching them approach, and felt nothing but a vast emptiness. Grant was dead. They had lost most of their equipment. The mission was a failure by any fair measure. The helicopters touched down in a clearing the team had marked with infrared lights. The spinning blades kicked up water and debris in a storm that made seeing difficult. The door gunners kept their weapons pointed outward, scanning for threats that had scattered hours ago. Professional carefulness, the kind that kept soldiers alive. Loading the wounded came first. 2 SEALs had been hit by shrapnel. Nothing that would kill them, but enough to need immediate medical attention. They moved on their own, faces tight with pain they refused to show. Grant went on last, wrapped in a poncho, because they had nothing else to use as a body bag. Park supervised the loading personally, making sure his man was treated with respect despite the situation. Elara waited her turn, rifle held across her chest. The weapon was filthy despite her earlier cleaning. Mud was packed into every crack. It would take hours to properly clean it. Hours she would spend in focused silence while her hands worked and her mind tried to process what had happened. The routine would help. It always did. But they were alive. 7 men who should have died in a swamp on Christmas morning were climbing into helicopters instead. That had to count for something. Hale approached her as they waited for the first helicopter to lift off. His face was drawn, looking 10 years older after one night. He did not say anything at first. He just stood beside her, looking out at the swamp that had nearly killed them both. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but filled with things that needed to be said, and the difficulty of finding the right words. Elara had imagined this moment during training. The satisfaction of proving herself to people who doubted her. In her imagination, it had been triumphant and satisfying. Reality was more complicated. She fell hollow, scraped clean of everything except exhaustion. The approval she had wanted for months felt meaningless next to Grant's body being loaded into a helicopter. "I've been doing this for 16 years. Hale said finally, his voice rough. "Seen a lot of people come through. Some wash out, some die. The ones who make it are usually the ones you expect. The veterans, the hard cases, The people who've been preparing their whole lives. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Then someone like you shows up, 19 years old, fresh out of training, and you're taking shots that veteran snipers wouldn't attempt. It challenges assumptions, makes you question what you thought you knew. 1,900 meters, he said finally, in the rain, at night. That's not supposed to be possible. No, Sergeant, Elara agreed. It's not. I was wrong about you. Hale turned to face her fully. We all were. You're not a kid. You're the reason we're breathing. Elara wanted to feel satisfied, to enjoy the recognition she had earned. But all she felt was tired and cold, and aware that nothing would ever be quite the same. Permission to carry Grant's tags, Sergeant, she said instead. Hale reached into his vest and pulled out the metal rectangles. He placed them in her palm. The tags were warm from his body heat. He would have wanted you to have them. Kid thought you were all right, even when the rest of us were being idiots. The helicopter settled onto a patch of solid ground. The spinning blades turned rain into horizontal needles. The team boarded in pairs, weapons ready even during extraction. When it was Era's turn, she paused at the door, looking back one last time. The swamp looked different in daylight, less scary, almost beautiful. Steam rose from the water in delicate spirals. Birds called to each other in the treetops. Life continuing despite the night's violence, not caring about human struggles. At the forward operating base, there was hot food and dry clothes and questions that could wait. The team scattered to their own concerns, debriefings and equipment checks, and the small routines that marked the end of combat operations. Elara found a quiet corner and pulled out her mother's letter one more time. You are strong enough. You just need them to see it. They had seen it now. The question was, what would change? Would tomorrow bring the same put-downs, the same assumptions that older meant more capable? Or had something shifted in that swamp? Something that could not be easily forgotten? Brooks. Park's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He held out a small object, dark green cloth wrapped around something hard. Team wanted you to have this. She unwrapped it carefully. A patch, unofficial and certainly not allowed by regulations. It showed rifle scope crosshairs over a Christmas tree with text below. Honor Shooter, Bravo 7. Someone had stitched it by hand. The work was rough but sincere. We're putting together a tree, Park continued. Nothing fancy, just some wood and whatever decorations we can find. Figured Christmas should be marked somehow, after the night we had. Elara nodded, not trusting her voice. The team was waiting outside, gathered around a small evergreen tree they had somehow found. It leaned badly to one side, decorated with empty shell casings and strips of colored wire. But it was theirs, and it was Christmas, and they were alive. The tree had been Cole's idea, apparently. He had found it growing near the motor pool and transplanted it with more excitement than gardening knowledge. The decorations were made from whatever the team could find. Empty magazines hung like ornaments. Trip flare containers served as makeshift lights, their bright colors cheerful despite their dangerous purpose. Someone had made a star from twisted wire, balanced unsteadily on the top branch. It was ridiculous and beautiful in equal measure, a defiant gesture against the violence they had just survived. Elara felt something crack in her chest. Some wall between herself and these men who had doubted her and then trusted her with their lives. They were flawed and stubborn, and sometimes infuriating. But they were also capable of creating beauty in a war zone, of marking Christmas with hope instead of despair. Hale stepped forward as she approached, the patch in his hand. He looked uncertain, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. Permission to make this official. Permission granted, Sergeant. He attached the patch to her shoulder with fumbling fingers that shook from more than cold. When he stepped back, the team stood at attention, not mocking, not dismissive, respectful. Now a 19-year-old, Hale said, his voice carrying across a small clearing. A soldier who kept her team alive when everyone else had given up. That's what you are, Brooks. That's what you'll always be. The words hung in the humid air, simple and meaningful. Elara felt something inside her shift. A weight she had carried for months suddenly felt lighter. Not gone, Never entirely gone, but manageable now. She could carry it. That night, she wrote a letter home. The words came slowly, not good enough to capture everything that had happened. But she tried anyway because her mother deserved to know, deserved to hear that her daughter had been enough, exactly as she was. The base around her was settling into evening routine. Generators hummed in the background, providing power for lights and refrigeration, and all the small comforts that made being deployed bearable. Someone was cooking something that smelled vaguely like barbecue. Music drifted from one of the tents. Country songs about home and heartbreak and highways. Elara wrote about the mission in broad strokes, leaving out the parts that would give her mother nightmares. She wrote about the men she served with, their initial doubt and eventual acceptance. She wrote about making a difficult shot when it mattered most, phrasing it as calmly as possible so it sounded like routine rather than the desperate gamble it had been. Most importantly, she wrote about understanding that proving yourself was not a single moment, but an ongoing process. Understanding that respect had to be earned again and again, not just once. Understanding that being enough meant accepting both what she could do and what she could not do, and knowing the difference between them. You were right, Mom. I was strong enough. They see it now. I see it too. Outside, the makeshift Christmas tree swayed in the breeze. Shell casings chimed softly against each other. Grant's tags rested against her chest. A reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, new chances to prove herself all over again. But tonight, on Christmas in a war zone, Elara Brooks sat among soldiers who had finally learned her worth. The patch on her shoulder felt heavier than its actual weight, carried with the burden of proof and the promise of future challenges. She knew tomorrow would bring new tests, new doubts to overcome, new moments where she would need to show abilities that others questioned. Yet something important had shifted in that swamp. She had stopped asking permission to be excellent. The approval of men like Hale mattered, but it was no longer necessary for her to feel good about herself. She was enough because she chose to be, because she had proven it to herself in the moment that counted most.